Hello and welcome to another episode of Something Rotten. It's our much acclaimed, asked for, no, begged for book season. We've stopped reading video games and we started reading books. Because that's what we did here, right? We've read video games. We are reading...
Jacob, respectfully, can you shut the hell up for a
Yeah.
second? You said you've been working on your Blake impression. And I have been patiently waiting for this shit. So let's hear it, Buster Brown.
I got a guitar and it's got 6 strings. It can play real low. That's it. Are you stunned?
I bought a 7-string guitar. I bought a 7-string. That was the whole thing. The 6-string is normal.
Oh, well, I assume you have one that has 6 strings as well.
I do, in fact. It was a pretty bad impression. Do you want to hear my Jacob impression?
Yeah.
I think about it a lot.
Oh, there he goes. He said the line, everyone. We are reading Ryu Murakami's In the Miso Soup. Last episode, we read the first 2 days of the book, which, if you have the kind of normal Barnes & Noble version, is up to page 147. This week, we are going to finish it. We're going to talk about the whole book, spoilers and all. As with last week, if you somehow skipped that one, trigger/content warning for every version of violence and sexual violence, violence against sex workers, sex work in general. It's a real rotten book, and so we will be talking about things that are upsetting. Just know that going in. Blake, you have read this book before, but you finished it again recently, and you messaged me, damn, forgot how wacky the end of this book is.
It's a weirdo. Yeah, it's weird. It kind of gets a little... There's like a slight touch of magical realism there at the end where Frank's like, I can read minds.
Oh,
which I guess like he's
been hypnotizing
he does hypnosis
people.
Yeah, but that's not magical realism to me. That's real. You know, the hypnosis is real, I think. He can't read minds. And just like in the very, like the 5th to last page, he's like, yeah, I'm psychic. Just deal with it. And then the book's like, all right, we're done.
Good night. Think about
Frank's
that,
whole origin story is so strange. Like this like weird small town picture Murakami paints of a town that's close to New York, Washington, Canada, and Portland. And I was like, oh, it's fucking Springfield.
It's that Simpsons movie joke. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real strange final, what is it, 60, 70 pages.
Yeah.
That I will say I read all today, so I really mainlined the last chapter of this book.
That's awesome, because I read it a few days ago, so it's had time to sink in, but also I may not be as fresh on what happened as you. But fortunately, it's not just Blake and I talking about it. We have returning champion of Something Rotten, returning to the show after stints on The Last of Us Part 2 and what other episodes? I know there's been...
That.
Really?
Just that.
Gosh, well, then an incredible waste for us to not have had her back on. Julie Muncy is back on the show.
Hello.
Julie, thank you so much for coming back on.
Of course.
When we started doing books, Blake and I were in agreement. It's like, well, we gotta have Julie on one. She's smart. She'll like to talk about books.
Yes, I studied books in college.
Wow.
Isn't that really all college is when you think about
exactly.
it? Exactly.
Everybody studies books in college, you know.
And yet somehow no one I was in classes with seemed to actually want to do that.
Do you mean you specifically were a literary major of some sort?
I was, yes.
Okay, got it. I'm sorry, I'm such a smart ass.
No, it's fine. I was joking,
Julie's...
mostly, but yes.
Since the last time you were on the podcast, many things have happened in the world. But most importantly and relevantly to you, you have released a video game.
I have, yes. Me and some other people released Interstate 35, which is an experimental visual novel set in the irradiated ruins of North Texas. It's about going home and religion and precarity, and people seem to really like it, and I think it's great, and I think you should play it.
This really seems like, look, if you're a listener of Something Rotten, this game seems entirely up your alley. I would really encourage everyone to check it out. It's got, I mean, as well as like very good writing, great music, great art. It really, like, It does not seem like a first-time game maker's game, which I know you're not the only person who worked on it, but like it's a really impressive first outing for you. Which
Thank you.
It is a first. Like you haven't
Yeah.
made other games, right?
No, like little experiments in Twine years ago, but yeah, this is my first game and my first Unity game, and so yeah, I spent half the time making it just trying to figure out where everything is. But yeah, no, it came out really well, I think. And it is one of Paste's top 50 games of 2024.
Holy
Look
shit.
at that. And
Congratulations.
that's a cool list to be on.
Yeah.
Okay. This ain't no IGN or MinMax top list. It's Paste.
I'll also say I just pulled it up on Steam and the music auto played, and it was very
It
good.
bangs, yeah. It's real good.
I was listening to it for like 30 seconds here, just being like, what is playing music? What's that? It's very good.
Now, Julie, had you read any of Ryu Murakami's other books? Have you
No.
read Audition, for
No,
instance?
this is my first exposure to Murakami.
Have you seen Audition?
I have not, no.
Okay.
Blake, having recently reread this, I mean, did you have... You pitched this one from the beginning. You weren't really like going back and forth on books, but like, do you have an internal Murakami ranking? Is this your favorite one?
I don't know. I've only read 4 of his books, and he has a lot of his books. It's probably my favorite. I also like Audition. 1969 is pretty cool, too. The sequel to this, or maybe it's the prequel, I can't remember. Piercing is probably my least favorite of his, though it's got its
there's
moments.
Is it a direct sequel?
No. But it's like spiritual sequel, but it is like billed as the sequel. I can't remember where they fall, but one is a sequel to the other. Piercing I don't like quite as much. This is probably my favorite, but 1969 is really cool because it's like mostly a comedy and semi-autobiographical. But if I'm really getting into the weeds of it, my favorite Murakami thing is actually the film he directed, which is an adaptation of his short story Topaz, Tokyo Decadence. I think that's the best thing I've encountered of his. And Jacob will be watching it for the bonus episode.
Okay. I'm ready. I will say, as someone who had not read this book and didn't even know what I was getting in for, we talked about last week, it's like kind of, things are happening. Oh, they're just walking around. They're doing a little sex tour. Ends with, one of the most shockingly violent scenes I have read in literature. I don't know what I thought the next, like the end third of the book was going to be, but like, I did not think it would be basically like nothing happens again, that it is just like Frank just talks for like the last 60 pages of this book, more or less. I found it really interesting, and we talked about how kind of like how easy of a writer Murakami is to read, where it's just kind of like he's not writing in like overly flowery or complex sentences, and it's like the ideas stand as interesting, but it's never kind of hard to get through. And it's like 4 people just kind of saying thoughts for like 60 pages, which is what this last section is. I was still as into it as I was in the beginning. Julie, I guess, here's a question. Did you like this book? Did you enjoy it?
That's a question I've been turning over in my head. And yes, also no, I don't know. It's the sort of, it kind of has sat on my palate since I finished it. And it's hard to make sense of the shape of it. It's a weird little thing. It's very artfully made.
I agree, and I think it is specifically like the complete ambiguity of the ending, where like, maybe I was kind of waiting for it to be like, and here's the big takeaway. And it, like, does not give you one of those. And so instead, you're just kind of, like, Frank is left alive and Kenji's left alive. And you're just there kind of thinking, like, oh, gosh, what does this mean for these characters' lives going forward? What? The world is not free from either of them. Blake, on your second time through, do you feel like you know what the big takeaway from this book is?
I don't know if I'm always a little hesitant to, prescribe specific meanings to things. Too clear cut. But I do think, I often like stories that center around the unknowableness of humans, there's no specific ones are coming to mind, but there's plenty of cool thrillers or horror movies where it's you didn't really know your husband at all, he had this whole other thing. And I think this book that is so obsessed with the comparing and contrasting two vastly different cultures, ultimately when it explains Frank's backstory, and it is baffling and inscrutable, lands in this weird place of we gave you 60 pages of explanation and we could never get to the bottom of him. I like where it kind of lands on the where Murakami being I can't figure these people out. I like that takeaway. I think it's an interesting way to end a book about the difficulties of understanding culture.
Yeah, it's kind of, people kind of reference and make fun of the ending of Psycho, where it's oh, this crazy horror happened with this guy, and then the last 5 minutes, there's a psychologist that comes in, and it's here's what was going on with this guy, blah, 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 and it just, tells you all of his, mental things and why he turned into a murderer. And what's interesting is that, Frank does that for himself, but it doesn't clear things up. And it's sometimes he is more sympathetic and sometimes he's just as terrifying.
But also the way it's written is so good. There's this dreamlike quality to just being a child. When you think back to shit that happened when you were 4, they feel remembering a dream, because your brain can't remember everything. And that's how Frank is telling this story that is I love to walk, and I had a brother, and I bit my mom and drank her blood, and I had a nanny.
All those things
and it's
happen.
Well, what are you talking about? It's it has this weird kind of dream quality to it that's very good.
Yeah, that whole last part of the book, since the abrupt violence, the whole thing feels kind of like this surreal hallucination. No one's quite acting the way I would imagine that they would. And Frank has, like we've said, this inscrutable, impossible small town origin story. And it's when reading a book like this, you want to ask yourself questions well, what does the book think about these people and these acts? And the answer is, I really don't know. Am I supposed to be sympathetic or not? Or terrified? Yeah, probably terrified, but all the other stuff feels so unstable in a way that's really interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting that it's almost immediately the first 2 days were really divided into a and that was the last I saw Frank that night, and then I went to bed and I woke up in the morning and then I met back up with him. And this does not have a break. It's immediately after the massacre at the nightclub, he's just still with Frank. It's, part 3 or day 3 or whatever. And Kenji, he started doing this within the massacre, but he is almost completely disassociating, as we're reading it. And what happens almost immediately upon starting this section is that Frank is oh man, that was really bad. There are lots of people inside me. That one was bad. Hey, Kenji, go tell the police. I'll be over here. Go tell the police. And then we get a lot of pages of Kenji just not being able to do it. And he's so scared to go to the police, and he thinks that Frank is going to kill him, but also he's wrestling with I don't know, maybe it's just a pain in the ass to go. That would be so much work for me to have to tell them. And maybe he doesn't feel sympathy for anyone who is killed at all. And it really just feels like we are watching Kenji detach from reality and completely be unable to deal with what happened in a way that almost makes Frank the more grounded character in a really weird way. Because it's when Frank comes back and starts talking to Kenji, Frank's Kenji, you good? You seem out of it, which is a weird position for the book to put us in.
Kenji wrestling with his sympathy is such an interesting thing. I think we can circle back to when they get to Frank's palace, as it is, his weird home he lives in. But I think where Murakami ultimately lands in his exploration of people Kenji's age in Japan, I think speaks to a lot of like Kenji ultimately being like, I guess I don't feel bad for these people, which I thought was kind of fascinating. And also Kenji kind of hating himself at the end of the book.
Yeah, there is this whole, as we talked about in the first part, there's like, Kenji is part of the sex industry, you know, undeniably. Like, he is one of the gears in this machine, but like, he does not really associate himself with it, and he really looks down on most of the people in it. You know, he's constantly talking about...
He does, to a point, though. The book, like, goes out of its way to, like, talk about immigrant sex workers in Japan and, like, really has kind of some, like, sympathy or understanding for them, and the way it does not...
But, like, that's from Frank. You know, that's not from Kenji.
True,
it's
but
like,
I'm just saying, like, it is the first time in the book where it's like, oh, okay, like, there's some grace here, actually. Not that I think Murakami hates sex workers, but it is, like, a tonal shift in the book.
Yes, you know, but, like, it is basically in... It feels like Kenji is trying to rationalize all of the reasons that he shouldn't go talk to the cops, which ultimately I think is just terror. Like, he is just so scared of everything that's happened, and he's scared of, like, Frank coming back and killing him. But, like, there's a part of him that he's like, I kind of hated all those people in that club. You know, maybe it's okay. Maybe, like, why should I care about them? And he kind of, like, decides that he doesn't feel sympathy for them or doesn't care about them, which is this disturbing kind of Kenji as society, where, like, he's been talking about how, you know, like, society doesn't care about sex workers, and also the people who were working in this industry are all kind of, like, hollow and whatever, and to see him take on this, like, morally indefensible stance of, like, maybe I just don't care about them is really weird. And it's like, is this a trauma response? You know, yes, but also is it like the values of society lowering onto him or whatever? I think both of these characters really become in this section like representations of their country. You know, it's like Frank is so much like America, or the Japanese perspective on America or whatever. And Kenji is some mix of that, too.
And there's, like, something he's kind of reaching for that I don't think he fully explores in the second to final location of the book, where all the houses become old, swallowed by all the new. I do think Kenji actually does, very briefly, offer, like, grace to the immigrant sex workers. I actually think he does, briefly, in the book. It's not a huge point.
Oh.
But I think he is, like... He points out, like, they're different. They're not like the rest of, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I think so. And there's a lot of, I mean, it's like these kind of throwaway lines where he's like, you know, the Japanese girls, they're selling it like out of some level of loneliness, which is different than like the Chinese, and then different from this like Peruvian woman who we get like pages and pages on. But it's, Julie, this is a big, this is a big question, because it is ultimately kind of what the book seems to be about. But in reading this, do you have a feeling on kind of everything seems to be kind of about cultural differences, and, you know, like the Japanese sex workers in other scenes are talking about their perspective on America, and Frank is whatever. What do you think, like, the idea of America is doing here? Is Frank, you know, is Frank America, or is Frank some, like, you know, twisted demonic version of American imperialism, or what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about Frank, I think, is that he is so hard to nail down, and his personality and what he's doing in the story seems to shift really radically. And, like, I think he's some sort of broad representation of America and American culture, and sort of there's this odd contradiction to him, where he can have moments where he appears just deeply empathetic and human, and then turns into this terrifying, violent monster. It's like, I remember very vividly in some, like, international relations class I took in college, like, there was this metaphor for thinking about how countries relate to American imperialism that describes the United States as like a baboon. And it's like, everything's fine until you fuck with a baboon. And then
it rips your face
yeah,
off.
exactly. And like, that's the sort of energy that Frank has, where there is that changeable and veneer of sort of almost kindness, almost decency, and then there's this deep violence underneath it. And underneath the violence, there might be a little bit more decency, but it's not clear, and he's just very unstable in that way.
He has this incredible ability to talk to people. Frank does, and it's often we're not really present for those full conversations, and so it's hard to know like how much is actually true, and how much he's kind of making up. But there is this thing where like while Kenji is theoretically going to report Frank to the police, Frank's like, I'm gonna go over there, there's like, someone I can hook up with, whatever. And he disappears for not that long, and when he comes back, he knows everything about this woman's life. This Peruvian woman who he was talking to. It's like he is really like gone so much deeper than the surface on like why she's there and what her motivations are, and like how she feels about this whole thing. And it is a level of connection that I don't think Kenji could manage. It's like Kenji does not like to learn things about people, and Frank does, and that makes him kind of, it's like he's just better at learning about people and seems more interested in it. But also he is this, demon in the story who does such great evil.
I mean, I think that's like I really struggle with Frank, and hearing you all talk about him has been very enlightening. But like I've thought a lot about, like, because this book is so obsessed with America and Japan, like where Murakami seems to ultimately land. And I feel like America kind of gets out a little unscathed compared to Japan. Like the book is so deeply critical of what would have then been like the younger, I don't know exactly, millennials, I guess, and paints them kind of, I don't know, myopically. I'm not sure. Like really, it seems to think they are very materialistic, airheaded. Kenji is included in this. I think it's like such a fascinating and maybe problematic perspective, because like it's not always great to read old dudes be like, well, the kids suck these days. But like I do think ultimately, like, even though Frank is this mass murdering American that's landed on Japanese soil, like the book is so much more critical of Japan than America ultimately, which I find interesting by the end.
That is interesting, and I hadn't necessarily thought of it that way, but I do feel like Frank is treated as kind of a force of nature.
Sure.
It's like the book almost doesn't criticize him, because it's like, well, what are we gonna do? Criticize like an earthquake that killed 1 million people, where it's like he's bad, but at the same time it is like the idea of stopping him, or it's like as much blame is put on Kenji for not doing anything about him as it is put on Frank for like doing the thing in the first place.
Yeah, and it's a little hard to talk about this because, to my knowledge, none of us are Japanese, so don't want to speak too out of turn here. But like, I do think ultimately, like, Murakami is spending a lot of this the back half of the book exploring his own opinions on like where his country is going, which I think also is why Frank lives in an old neighborhood, like full of old houses compared to like new high rises or whatnot. But I don't know that I'll have the lived experience to know ultimately what's going on there.
Yeah, well, and importantly, I don't think if, that old neighborhood is also not good, because it's like as they're leaving it, Kenji realizes like, oh wait, this neighborhood is full of toxic waste. Like that's why no one lives here anymore, is because there was like a chemical leak. And so if that represents, the old Japan perspective, I think Murakami is also like, well, that was also fucked.
I guess that's true. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Here's something that I thought was interesting. Kenji has so much trouble going to the police. Frank comes back eventually, and Kenji's like, Frank, did you hypnotize me? Frank's like, what are you talking about? And seems genuinely confused that like that would even be be a possibility. And Julie, I have an answer in mind about this, but I'm curious with your perspective, like, does Frank respect Kenji?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think he does in some twisted way. I think he respects Kenji the way I don't know, not even the way you respect a pet, because I think people are better to their pets. But in this almost kind of paternalistic way, but he does, I think, differentiate in his mind the humanity of Kenji versus the humanity of other people. But I also think the degree to which he differentiates that is a lot of it seems to be based on kind of a whim. And I think Kenji, part of the critique of Kenji and his cultural background in this is that I think Kenji overestimates his own security at any point. Like, I feel like there are moments where Kenji nearly gets his throat slit, and it just doesn't happen for some kind of strange coincidence or a whim, and Kenji doesn't seem to fully grasp how much danger he's in.
Yeah, I think the question of, like, is there anything that actually separates Kenji from the people that Frank killed? And I don't think the answer to that is yes, but at the same time, like, I think Frank likes him, even if he doesn't respect him. Like, it seems like Frank legitimately enjoys his company. And so it's one of those weird things of, like, is it just because Kenji is kind of providing a service to him, that he's the one showing him around or whatever, or is there, like, something about him specifically that endears Frank to him that didn't endear him to all the people he killed, for instance? And Kenji is pretty unremarkable, I guess, is what I come down on. And so it's like, he doesn't seem like he has any secret sauce that, like, the other people in the story don't have. He just kind of lucked into being Frank's friend. Let's talk about this Peruvian sex worker. Because there's a line that I wrote down that I thought was really interesting, which is that she came over here, she's sending money back home. She came here because Jesus loses his power in Japan, was her reasoning. That, like, she was religious, and we assume, the religion would say that doing sex work is bad, but not in Japan, which I just, like, if you write the line, Jesus loses his power in this country, I am going to pay attention. And I wasn't sure if that was just, like, kind of a hollow rationalization for a character, or, like, there's a lot of talk about other religions in this section. We get, like, a whole thing on, like, what the bells mean and what kind of Bono, which is the like Buddhist idea of things, or is it Buddhism? Do you guys remember?
Kenji points out he doesn't remember if it's Buddhism or Shintoism, so we'll
okay.
offer you some
Great.
grace here, Jacob.
That was great. But yeah, the idea of, like, especially if Christianity is kind of like the West coming in, the idea that, like, oh, Jesus doesn't have any power here struck me as a really interesting idea, especially, because this is a story about, like, all the great miso soup of all the influences coming together. Blake, you think Jesus has power in Japan?
They got, like, a weird amount of Catholic church.
Yeah?
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe Jesus is putting down some roots. There's a town in Japan. This is a true story. There's a town in Japan. This is not a true story that they tell, but this is a true story that it's a thing that they say. There's a town in Japan that preaches that Jesus faked his death and moved to Japan, and they have this whole burial spot for him. So if he has no power in Japan, why did he live over there? Riddle me that. Seems like he was chilling.
Are there Japanese exorcism movies that are specifically like possessed by
Oh,
the devil as we understand it?
I don't know. There must. I don't know. I don't know.
Because it's like they're definitely like possession movies, right? But it's like I don't know if it's like Satan is the one possessing versus some other, bad thing that's possessing you. There's then what we kind of get there is, or in the next section, is a lot of thoughts from Frank about why Japanese culture is the way it is, which is really interesting to hear because he is an American coming in and, telling Kenji, who is a Japanese man, like about it. But one of the most interesting bits is, well, okay. And also this is Frank recounting, what a Lebanese man told him.
An old Lebanese journalist told the Peruvian sex worker.
Right. Okay. So it's like third hand, but
we're
I'm
playing
just
a
going
game
to
of
read
telephone at this point.
Yeah, Frank talked to the sex worker. He heard something that a Lebanese journalist told him. A history of being invaded and assimilated is the one thing that most countries in Europe and the New World have in common, so it's like a basis for international understanding. But people in this country don't know how to relate to outsiders because they haven't had any real contact with them. That's why they're so insular. According to the Lebanese man, Japan's just about the only country in the world that's been untouched, except for the US. But he said, of course, there's a bright side to that too, and started telling her about the bells, saying that precisely because the Japanese have never experienced a real invasion, there's a certain gentleness here you can't find in other countries, and that they've come up with these incredible methods of healing. That is a wild proposition.
Also, somewhat inaccurate, right? After World War II, America was like, we live here now. We're gonna build our buildings. And weirdly enough, Murakami did grow up right next to a U.S. air base.
Well, and I think that's why, and Frank saying this, it's like, and it's also inaccurate because, like, the U.S. was absolutely colonized. It was just colonized by the people who were still living in it. And so it is this weird, like, Frank, an American man telling a Japanese man, you guys are so gentle because you've never been invaded, is this like completely insane thing to say that I think we're supposed to hear as absurd. I don't think we're supposed to take this at face value, but it's like, it's such a wild thing to say.
I should say I was not saying I thought Murakami was factually inaccurate. It's just a wild thing like to think about.
Yeah, but I think it represents, like, I think there is a kind of American impulse to like make sense of why this other country is the way it is, and it's very interesting that like Frank kind of lands on this explanation of like, you're so gentle because you've never been invaded before, as like his way of understanding Japan, which just seems fundamentally flawed.
Well, in some ways it seems like it's saying that Americans can only understand things through violence, Like, Japan is very confusing to an American in this book. I mean, because as we see, Japanese people in this world don't know what to do when confronted with violence. We have to read a vivid description of a woman shitting her pants, and not being able to, like, move. It's very funny that Frank cannot comprehend how a country could operate without, like, violent overruling,
Yeah. And there's actually, that continues because he's still talking about what he learned from that Peruvian woman who he talks about how the Japanese women that he murdered didn't know anything about their history, and that this woman who he's talking to knew way more, which is also like, Frank, you talked to them for like 5 minutes and then you killed them. But it's a very kind of like, the Japanese don't know enough about their own history. Here's what I learned from this Peruvian woman, which I found really interesting. But he describes how, like, when the Portuguese brought rifles to Japan, they started having wars all the time. Japan started invading other countries, but they were bad at occupying countries. And then there's this line where he says, this misguided sort of warfare continued right up until the A-bombs fell. And then after that, Japan changed its way of thinking and gave up war and started making electric appliances and became an economic superpower. So obviously that was the path the country should have followed all along. Where it is like the idea that he's like, you know, well, after you were decimated by war, you started making electronics, and that was what you should have been doing the whole time, is such a funny perspective to have, to be like, you're making microwaves? You should have been doing this in, like, the 1600s?
Really quick, I'm not a historian, but I feel like they were also kind of good at colonizing countries. Like, I don't think they were particularly. They kind of did a bit of it. Like, I think they were pretty good at it.
Yeah, but this totally kind of warped view, and then the paternalism coming in of like, well, you guys are doing, you know, like the U.S. dropping A-bombs on you, that got you on the path you should have been on all along. Yeah, very much. He is really saying you're welcome. And
what are a few lives lost to invent the Game Boy, you know?
And throughout this, Kenji just has no thoughts at all. Like, he really just kind of lets these words from Frank wash over him. By this point, they're in an abandoned hospital. They just go to Silent Hill in this game.
I had a thought I kind of lost, but it's such an interesting juxtaposition between like a complete misanthrope, Kenji, and just a wild, curious idiot, Frank. Like, once you strip the murder back, like, what a buddy comedy this truly is in this final, like because like the only character we have to latch onto is this person who is like, I don't think there's anything between Kenji's ears. He is so like beat down by life that like, and we have to like consume his thoughts. It's just a fucking hallway up there.
Just his thoughts definitely seem to just reflect the last person he heard talk, or like the last set of like just animal impulses he had, whether that's fear or anger or whatever. And yeah, from the outside, Kenji's kind of a cipher. He's this quiet, weird dude who lives embedded in this subculture, but in a fundamentally extractive way. And then he, you know, meets Frank and kind of teeters into the edge of this violent dream reality. And yeah, he's very much a passenger in what kind of becomes the homoerotic adventures of Kenji and Frank right at the end. And it's very strange.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, bouncing between like Kenji's job, which is to like take very curious and horny foreigners around this kind of like world they don't understand, and his own like inherent apathy for like his country and the like specific neighborhood he's in, you know.
Yeah, and we had talked about in the first part that we know Frank has had part of his brain removed. We get confirmation that like he was literally lobotomized. Like that's what it was. And it's weird that we're talking about Kenji kind of having nothing going on, this detachment, which like does feel in a way like he is lobotomized. Like he just has these very mild reactions to horrifying things that happen around him, even though Frank is the one who literally has had part of his frontal lobe taken out.
I thought they did lobotomies through the nose, though. And he talks about he had a hole drilled in his head, right? And an ice picked down. I thought you did, like the fucking Ramones song. You stick it up their nose.
No idea. And I'd rather not look it up.
I believe it was through the nose. Well, look, Google AI overview says that a surgeon would use an ice pick like instrument. So we know that that's got to be the case.
Did you Google lobotomy how to? Like I just
yeah.
Can
we get a YouTube tutorial?
You can do it through the eyelid. You can go through the eyelid or the nose. I'm not seeing anything drilling through the skull like such.
Do you know, Blake, that drilling through the skull is like one of the earliest forms of surgeries that humans did?
Really?
That it's called like trepanning or something. I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced, but like we have found skulls thousands and thousands of years old that have clearly intentional holes drilled in them that are not like, and we killed this guy, but like this was clearly a medical procedure.
Wow. Holy shit.
Can't imagine they were that effective, but like it's something we've been trying for a long time.
What do you know?
I'm just saying I can't imagine. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I just have trouble imagining.
Did y'all ever play that game, The Town of Light? Or fuck, what was it called? I reviewed it for GameSpot. It was horrible. Town of Light, I think. You have to like do a lobotomy to someone in that game. Like that's like the only thing I remember is like you walk around this asylum and it's boring, and then like you give someone a lobotomy, and that's the game.
Well, I played Surgeon Simulator where you do a brain transplant, so I assume it's similar to that.
Yeah. Do people we don't still do lobotomies, right? I know this is a dumb guy question, but we don't. That's not like a thing we do anymore, right?
No, they stopped in like the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay. It's always later than you expect, you know?
Oh, yeah. Look, JFK's sister. Like famous lobotomy receiver.
That's right. They have that Family Guy joke about it.
Julie, you are a pathologic, I don't know, expert, but certainly passionate player.
Uh-huh.
You do any lobotomies in that? I know you do strange medical procedures, but I haven't played enough to know if you get to the skull.
You can remove people's brains and make tinctures with them, yes.
I'm sorry, what are you all talking about?
The game Pathologic 2.
Oh.
Yeah. But
what did you think was happening?
I'm not sure I knew there was a game called Pathologic. And so
Blake, you're gonna get so many emails to the Something Rotten account. Don't do this.
And all of a sudden, I was like, I didn't know Julie was a surgeon. Like, you know how Moses Slack is a surgeon. His business card just says, "Yeah, I'm a surgeon." I was like, "Wow, Julie, I didn't know you did that." Writer, surgeon, it's all on the business card.
Yeah, but it is fascinating, this idea of frankly being lobotomized, because like the reason that people did lobotomies was basically like you are too hard to control. You know, like we need to just like take the volume down on you several notches, and so like you would turn someone, you know, almost entirely passive. And so then this idea of lobotomizing someone who then goes on a horrific murder spree is like, well, that didn't work the way it was intended. But also, Frank does seem in other ways like he is very, you know, passive or what. I mean, he basically, he says many times that he has multiple personalities living in his head. And it's not like a kind of gimmicky, like the mean guy comes out, then the nice guy comes out. But you know, like it's hard for us as the reader to determine when he's talking from what personality, or if that is how this manifests. But like worth pointing out that like Frank talks about there being several people inside his head. Then we learn about the bells and Bone No, which is on New Year's. There's a thing where a bunch of temples ring a bunch of bells. It's kind of like releasing sins or something, and Kenji gives a very half-remembered explanation of it, which Blake said he can't remember if it's Buddhism or Shintoism. But basically, it is this idea that is kind of similar to like original sin almost, that just like everyone is born with bad instincts and everyone kind of has them, and then, you know, it's whatever, you do what you can to release them or forgive yourself for them or whatever. But what's interesting about this is Frank is super touched by this explanation, where Kenji says that like Frank looks like he's going to cry, basically, which does, you know, like make sense, because as Frank has described himself, he doesn't really love murdering, but he just feels like it's his destiny, more or less. And so then he almost gets like a get out of jail free card of being like, it's not me, it's just these like these sins that I was born with. And so it, you know, it totally made sense to me why Frank would be so into this idea of everyone kind of having having original bad things with them.
We talked about it a little bit, but what did you all make of Frank's origin? Like biting his mom and killing 2 mystery people and a swan. What the hell was going on?
Yeah, it's weird because it's, on the one hand, extremely vivid and detailed and does kind of hold together, but on the other hand, it's from this dream vision of America. That's impossible. And, like, we talk about, like, lived experience and how we don't have lived experience of being Japanese, and it's, you know, Frank is from a vision of America that is sort of filtered through culture and also doesn't have that lived experience. Like, the geography is weird, and I think, like, the book's aware of this. They make this point several times that these Japanese people have this sort of abstracted and strange view of America, and Frank seems to come from that America instead of the real one. And so it's this weird, alarming dream, and at no point do I know how much we're supposed to believe Frank. Kenji does implicitly, but I don't know if any or all of it is true or what. Yeah. It's really blank interpretively. Like, I'm not sure what to make of the shape of it.
I was, the other day, I was watching the excellent movie Trap by M. Night Shyamalan, which has a lot of great sociopath pseudoscience where they're just talking about, like, here's the thing that make a killer, and they have this, like, crime psychologist who's talking about that, you know, they hide it so well from everyone that maybe their own mother could see it, but after that, no one would be able to detect it. And I love the idea in that movie that if your child has bad vibes, it's not because you are failing as a parent in some way. It's just that you are the only one who can detect that they are, in fact, a sociopath. And it is, like, when Frank is so young in his own telling of, like, when he starts killing people. He's, like, 4 and 7 years old doing this stuff. And I'm like, is this truly just, like, a born evil thing? Because it's, like, you know, he doesn't really describe things from his childhood that would be, like, so traumatizing that he would start killing.
Have you never seen Halloween?
Actually, no.
This is literally the plot of Halloween. Like, Dr. Loomis has this huge monologue about this.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there you go. No, I've just seen Trap twice.
Nah, some kids are just born evil. You gotta put them... Frank is just a Michael Myers. That's all that's really going on here.
What if the kid has bad vibes? Yeah. It's very much the like, Dexter model of serial killers, or the Hannibal model, that these are just these weird, impossible, broken people that don't really exist, and they, you know, are just born bad, and they suck, and everyone should realize that they suck.
And
also,
I do think it's interesting. Go ahead.
Also, Jacob, write it down. You are watching Halloween for the bonus episode. You are.
I can't watch the number of things that you've said I'm watching for the bonus episode.
2?
We also talked about watching Love and Pop.
3? You'll be fine. Halloween is like 80 minutes long. You can watch it over lunch.
And I will. What I like about this kind of psychological reading is we actually do have conversations with a psychologist from Frank's childhood that are clearly bullshit, because it's like, he watched too many horror movies and he didn't, like, nurse enough. And I think it's like, we are supposed to read it as like, this guy's fucking stupid. Like, he doesn't realize that Frank was just born evil, and that's what he should be saying.
Do y'all think that's true? Some people just born evil?
No.
I don't know.
Probably not.
Just curious. I'm just asking questions.
It's a fair question.
I mean, I think it determines a lot of the American criminal justice system, is a belief that people are just born evil.
Yeah, y'all ever heard of super predators that Clinton was talking about? Hillary Clinton was going on about for a little while there.
So Frank likes getting lost, or he finds it very scary, but he also likes it. And he writes about how he he like knew basically the block that he grew up on, and as soon as he walked off that block, he was like so just out of it and didn't know where he was, and he kept doing it because he enjoyed it, but he also got really scared by it. And then at one point he gets lost, and his mom shows up and finds him, and he bites her and drinks her blood, which is a thing that comes back, and he's like, drinking blood, it's not like great, but like sometimes you just do it, you know? Like he's very casual about the whole idea. And then later there's a swan, or there's like a group of swans, and he's very still until one of them comes over, and then he breaks its neck and drinks its blood, which is, it's weird because the things that he's describing are like, you know, Michael Myers, whatever type stuff.
Well, you haven't seen that movie, you don't know.
Okay, well, they're a thing that a bad guy would do, but he says it so casually, and he's just kind of like, I don't know, I did this, that you're kind of like, I don't know, I guess it is like chill. You know, he just had a weird upbringing.
I'm going to kind of take us off course, but I've always really loved Frank's description of getting lost. Like, I find it so evocative. Of like, like I love the feeling of going somewhere and somewhere new, like that you don't know, if it's at a different country or just in your own town, and be like, oh, I literally don't know what's beyond this street corner. Like it's like, if I can't see it, it's a different world to me. Like I remember walking down my street for the first time, like having not looked at a map or anything, and be like, oh my god, there's a train station here, and it blew my mind, and now it's boring to me. I just really love this section where Frank talks about walking as a kid and getting lost because he's like he's a little stupid kid and can't remember directions.
Yeah, I mean, and I think
it's a really evocative section.
It's like Frank is not entirely unrelatable. You know, like he says some things in his just ramblings that you're like, I guess I do kind of agree with that, which is then weird because he says other things that are completely out of pocket.
Right. Yeah. Like his description of coming to the edge of the world he knew and then realizing that reality is much, much bigger. It reminds me of like when I was a kid, I was allowed to go for walks in my neighborhood by myself if I went one route. And there was another route that took me through a much larger portion of the neighborhood. And that route I was only allowed to go on if I had my parents with me or if I was feeling like breaking the rules. And just like, it's like just a couple of small streets felt like these two vastly different versions of reality. And I think like it captures that feeling really well. And that's the point where Frank's story feels the most real. And then it sinks back into the violent hallucination Michael Myers stuff.
This is, look, while we're kind of off topic here, I was obsessed with this book that I got from the book fair that I think was called like Invasion of the Lawn Weenies or something. That was it was a book of short stories that clearly had like there were kind of short horror stories that some publisher had got a hold of and was like, I know how we can make this appeal to kids, and they just put like, you know, a bunch of hot dogs on the cover. But there was a story that I still think about in it that was about a kid who liked walking kind of down his block and back with his eyes closed, and he would see how far he could get from his house closing his eyes. And then like one time he gets kind of interrupted and he opens his eyes before he can complete the loop, and he's like in this kind of different reality that he doesn't recognize, and he kind of like can't get back to his normal house. And it is that kind of another way of like getting lost, or I know what's around me, but then I don't really know what's around me.
Brother,
would
would you believe this is a big ol' series? Invasion of the Road Weenies and the Land of the Lawn Weenies, the Battle of the Red Hot Pepper Weenies.
It must have been in the Land of the Lawn Weenies is the one that I read. Anyway, if Something Rotten readers or listeners, if you read In the Land of the Lawn Weenies, write in. I want to know.
But we're not reading it.
Hey, get ready for the bonus, Blake. Gonna read Land of the Lawn Weenies.
Nah, I haven't. I got 3 movies to fucking watch.
Frank one thing that we haven't talked about, Frank, that Kenji spotted in the first section is he does have like scarred wrists where he's had a number of suicide attempts, which he also writes about pretty blasely.
I couldn't really figure out if they were suicide attempts though, or Frank was just drinking his own blood. Did I misread? Or is it
I think it's ambiguous.
Doesn't he talk about how he
liked?
Yeah, I guess he writes about he liked the feeling of slitting his wrists.
I did not come away thinking it was like, I think Kenji reads it that way, but like when Frank talks about it, I didn't get the sense he was trying to kill himself.
That's interesting. I guess I assumed that they were self-harm scars, and I'd never really reconsidered. But yeah, that makes sense.
I could be wrong. I don't know, but nevertheless.
But then Frank also says something that he basically talks about how he both feels like the world is at his feet and that he has this intense anxiety about everything, which, if we are taking him as a representation of America, I think really does work. Or, the kind of the baboon analogy of like, he both feels totally in control and also he's like super anxious all the time that things are going to go out of his control, which I was like, yeah, that makes sense for Frank and how I'm understanding Frank as a metaphor. But there is like a turn that happens around here that we've suggested, which is like Kenji really starts to get on Frank's side. Towards the end of the book, it just feels like Frank has almost totally won him over. And in part, he's like, I don't have much to say about, there are like a number of pages where Kenji just basically decides that all of society are hypocrites. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, or he's just thinking about Japanese society and he's like, all these people want our money. And I don't really like have any deep thoughts about that. But he does say that, like, because he has kind of dehumanized Frank's victims, he's like, Frank resisted. Everyone else kind of let themselves be killed by Frank. But Frank, like, wouldn't let society get him down, which is this weird recontextualizing of everything that's happened.
Yeah.
You got something to say?
I struggle with Frank so much, but I really think Kenji is Murakami's apathy. Like, and I don't necessarily think this part is explicitly... In some ways, I just feel like the Kenji's final thoughts at the end of this book are just Murakami's. Like, and I don't think Murakami is like, I'm down with the American Psycho here. But I do think this, like, complete apathy for this generation of Japanese people, I read it as, like, literal from the author here. It's very cynical, but I also don't really know how to square Frank. Like, he's a fucking enigma to me. So, I don't know. I don't necessarily think we're supposed to look at Kenji at the end of this book as, like, the fuck you on about, dude? Like, I think this is just Murakami speaking here.
That's interesting, because that's not how I read... the idea of Frank as someone who resisted society seems completely just off base to me in a way where it's like, not that the book is, but like, that felt to me like Kenji is trying to make sense of why he hasn't done anything about Frank. That it's Kenji is like, feeling guilty, feeling whatever about, like, there could have been many times that he, like, called the cops on Frank or did something and he didn't. And then this recontextualizing of him as someone who resisted in the same way that, like, what America is, for instance, has been, taken from, like, a fundamentally genocidal project that, like, wiped out indigenous populations and, waged wars across the globe to, like, people with a spirit of freedom or whatever. Like, it does feel that it's just such a ridiculous take to me to view Frank as resisting and the people he murdered as not resisting, that I saw it as, the book trying to puncture Kenji's thinking about Frank. But like, I think it's really interesting that, Blake, that you see it as almost the opposite.
Yeah, it's, again, hard to parse. And it's, yeah, I mean, you could definitely see the degree to which, if Kenji is going to be a person who does nothing about the existence of a guy like Frank, what that leaves him with ideologically is basically where he ends up, in cynicism and apathy. That's the only way to really make that make sense to yourself. And it's, I mean, there's almost a bit of like a conversion narrative to it, right? Where he's, kind of baptized into this impossible, horrible belief system. And it, builds on and feeds on his own misanthropy. He's a part of the sex industry, but he hates and looks down on the sex industry. And like, he ends up being sort of Frankified a little bit. And,
he gets Frank pilled.
Yeah, exactly. And like, it's, I don't know if Murakami is necessarily like fully identifying with it, but I think Murakami is pointing to this as being in some way emblematic of his own psyche or the Japanese psyche or something about that culture.
Yeah. I think he's someone who's thinking a lot about where he lives, and this book is like really wrestling with a lot of those ideas. Not in the sense that I think he sympathizes with Frank or even, you know what I'm saying? But I think if you were to like really dumb it down, I feel like Murakami would be like, well, I would rather have a conversation with Frank than Kenji.
Yes.
Like that's who I would rather spend time with if I had to, which I think is like an interesting idea.
Yeah, and in the last few pages, I mean, literally in the last like 10 pages of the book, Frank basically starts describing himself again as not as a natural disaster, but like as a virus that is necessary for human development. He says, basically he talks about how like all the violence that he's doing is to fight off senility, to like keep your brain active and working, and how society is not giving people as many chances to do that. He says there aren't that many genuinely effective ways to guard against senility. Kids are especially vulnerable because their options are so limited. And now with all this social surveillance and manipulation going on, I think you'll see an increase in people like me, where Frank is basically saying that like modern society is breaking more people's brains to turn them into killers. It's around this place where he also says that killing is his destiny.
I think this is also the plot of Halloween. It's a little muddy right there, but I think that's also kind of in Halloween.
A little bit. Yeah, and it's very similar to sort of the contemporary, alt-right description of most people as NPCs, right? And like this is sort of his way of un-NPCing himself. And it reminds me of, I don't know if either of you have read any Don DeLillo. He has this very short story, it's like 2 pages, called Videotape. And it's about a murder being shown on television and this person who can't stop watching it. And it's about the same thing, how, this mediated environment and contemporary society gives birth to serial killers and to the impulse to kill and replicate these things, and almost the kind of hypnotic magnetism of that sort of violence. And yeah, it's a lot of what Frank has going on and is gesturing toward here, that in some way he's a natural conclusion of the system he's in.
Yeah, I think you hear the kind of idea a lot that like you know, when they had the Colosseum and they had gladiators fight, it was because like people needed to get their bloodlust out somehow. And, you know, this kind of like society always trends toward violence. And so in what ways do we like build it into society? And I think it's interesting in this book, which Blake, you've described as being like pretty condemning towards the young people, that I think in this section specifically, he's being like, the culture that we have built for them is breaking them. You know, that the idea that like we're so kind of locked down and, you know, Puritan and surveillance and whatever, that like people are going crazy because the culture is making them crazy.
But also like the idea of like the work culture creates materialistic teens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if your parents are just driven by money, like you might become a child driven by money. And we see that in one of the women Frank murders, right? I can't remember exactly, but she's like comically materialistic. So it's like, yeah, I guess I don't fully think like Murakami's just like the past was better, but rather he's exploring where maybe his own issues with a younger generation are coming from.
Yeah. Then there is, I mean, and then it's like, you know, I think we're always supposed to kind of see Frank as a psycho, because he says that he's a virus, and he's like, but maybe I'm necessary to humanity. You know who's not necessary to humanity? That homeless guy. Right. You know, where he kind of is still like, it's good. Me being a murderer is more important than these other people who aren't doing anything.
He says some insane thing about like, maybe HIV will be good in 1,000 years.
Like,
it's like, what the fuck are you talking about,
dude.
Frank?
Which this actually...
You do not have to give it to him.
No, this brings me to something else about Frank that's really interesting to me, that stuck out to me, is that he's obsessed with sex work, and the whole book is about orbiting that sex industry. But he never actually has sex. He backs it down in the last moment every single time.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting and weird. It's a book about sex with no sex in it.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, the age-old kind of truth about, like, sexual violence of, like, rape is not about sex, it's about power, very much feels that, like, it is true here of, like, Frank is not interested in these people because he, like, wants to, you know, come. It's that he wants to like feel his ability to dominate people, which is something that he expresses throughout the book. But you're right. I mean, even after the massacre, he's like, okay, are there like any people around here that I can have sex with? And Kenji points him right at one, and then he goes and he like talks to her for half an hour instead of having sex. So then we reach the finale, which is Kenji's kind of bad thought up plan is like, we're going to go to this bridge. My girlfriend June is also going to be at the bridge. He tells her, like, I'm going to be there with Frank, and I'm going to walk towards you. And if anything happens, you know, tell the cops, because there will be a bunch of cops there. And then he gets to the bridge, and he basically finds that he has no real motivation to, like, turn Frank in or have anything bad happen to him. Frank says that he's like, okay, well, first we got to talk about the miso soup thing. We get the title of the book. We get in the miso soup, which is Frank basically describes himself as like, I don't know, I'm like, I guess I'll say, I'll read it. He says, I don't need to eat this stuff. He said he wanted to eat miso soup because he had it in like a Chinese restaurant or a Japanese restaurant in Colorado, and he liked it, and so he came to Japan. He says, I don't need to eat the stuff now because I'm here, right in the middle of it. The soup I ordered in Colorado had all these little slices of vegetables and things, which at the time just looked like kitchen scrapings to me. But now I'm in the miso soup myself, just like those bits of vegetable. I'm floating around in this giant bowl of it, and that's good enough for me. What does this mean? For being like the title of the book, I really am kind of at a loss of what to take from it.
It's funny because also it does kind of read like a punchline, because his whole motivation, the whole book, to come to Japan, do all these things, is the single most basic Japanese export dish you can imagine. It's just
it feels
soup.
Like he ate rice and was like, I have to come to Japan.
Right, and that's on one hand, really, really funny.
Can I tell y'all something crazy that happened? So this
Yeah.
is on the second to last page of the book, at least in the version I have. I finished the book, I stood up, and I walked into the kitchen, and my roommate, my beloved AJ Moser, in fact had a massive bowl of miso soup just sitting on the counter. And I was like, what are the
Damn.
fucking odds?
You said I'm floating around in there.
I jumped in his bowl.
I mean, I do think it's, it is representative. Frank is basically saying, like, I wanted to experience the culture, and now look at me. I'm here. I'm experiencing the culture, which is like, no, you're not. First of all, like, you've been on like a 3-day sex tour. You don't like understand what Japan is about. But it is this kind of like, at the same time, if he is representative of America, like, yeah, maybe he is just this like inextractable part of the culture, that like American violence has shaped this country, and now it's swirling around with all of the other cultural influences from all of the other things that Murakami has been writing about. But like, it's a weird thing to be the name of the book. And I was kind of trying to think back on the book and be like, so what other parts of this are kind of representative of people being in the miso soup? And I found it really challenging. I don't really understand the weight of the metaphor.
But what can you do?
Hey,
You know?
Something Rotten listeners, write in, correct us.
What does something rotten mean, Jacob? Come on. Sometimes shit just sounds cool.
Yeah,
That's
and
right.
it is interesting.
Sometimes Max Payne says it.
Yeah, that I'm pretty sure it's the only mention of miso soup in the whole book. And so it's
Oh, yeah.
so it's strange. I don't like with everything else. It just sits kind of oddly.
But he's getting ready to break with Kenji. Kenji's gonna go to June. He says he's disappointed that they didn't have miso soup. Frank says that, and Kenji's like, I suggested we could still have miso soup together sometime. And he doesn't seem to be saying this as a bluff. Like, it really feels like Kenji is being like, if you want to hang out again, like, I'll be around. Which is, again, it's like, Kenji has been won over by Frank. He is now kind of under this guy's spell. And then Frank gives him an envelope, and it has a swan feather in it, representative of the swan that Frank killed and drank its blood. And I'm not quite sure what this means. I was looking at people talking about this book on Reddit, and someone was very confidently like, this feather means that Frank is going to come back and kill Kenji. I was like, I don't think it's that cut and dry, but it is this reminder of Frank's violence and like what brought him on the path to that. But it's,
And also, touchingly, Kenji's like the first friend Frank's ever had, It is like a fucked up nice, it's like a really fucked up nice gesture from Frank, to be honest.
Hey, Frank's been walking around with that swan feather in his pocket for years, just hoping that he would be friends with someone and he could give it to him.
Yeah, it's like the book ends on a note that almost feels weirdly wholesome until you stop and think about it for any length of time. And like, that's obviously intentional. Like, Murakami knows what he's doing, but I don't really know what he's doing.
Yeah, I think anything where like a piece of media where like someone receives a gift from someone else, after the thing is done, it's like, okay, well, this is going to be the memory of that person that stays in your life, and so if nothing else, it's like, Kenji's going to be thinking about this, this story about the swan and Frank and whatever is now in Kenji's brain, and it is going to become a part of him, or it already has, because like the Frank's kind of philosophy on like life and violence and whatever, Kenji has just kind of uncritically received it. But yeah, it's like thinking about Kenji's life going forward is kind of a horrifying prospect, because like I don't think his interactions with Frank are going to improve his outlook in any way, and I wonder if he if he starts killing people, or if he devalues life, or if he just kind of remembers this interesting weekend he had with his friend Frank.
So did you like the book?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, I think, there are like, I like any time that I can just remember kind of certain paragraphs with interesting ideas. And I think that this book is just, it's like, I took so many notes that were just me writing down something that someone said on a page. I think that it is just full of like things to kind of roll around in your head. I really liked it. And I also think that it's interesting for something containing an unbelievably gratuitous scene of violence, for it to like really not, if I was telling someone about this book, that would, it wouldn't even be like the fifth thing that I told them about, probably. It's, it's like, it almost feels inconsequential, even though it is the event that the entire story is kind of built around.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. Buckle up, though, because we're reading Dennis Cooper next book season, and you're going to really learn what violent books are all about. Yeah. I'm glad you liked it, though, Jacob.
Yeah, I had a great time. Julie, have you... I don't actually know much about your, like, reading habits. Does this feel like other things that you've read? Do you have other other, like, I don't know, recommendations,
right,
or even thoughts of like, this is kind of like that?
I probably have read other things like this, but it's very distinct and strange, and I enjoyed it in the sense that I found it, wildly interesting. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's not a book that brings to mind other books like it immediately. But
well, there's the sequel, Piercing.
Can't wait. I just think I really think, as reading this as, I'm sure it would be interesting to read this as a Japanese person and be like, what's it saying about Japanese culture? But like, there is some of the same intrigue in this to like really dumb it down as like, what is like Metal Gear Rising saying about America, right, or something, like games that are like made by Japanese creators about American politics have this interest of like, what is your perspective on what we're doing or whatever. And this is in a similar way, where it's like, it is giving many perspectives on America and many perspectives on Japan, and kind of trying to parse those out, I think is just a really like enjoyable and crunchy part of the book. Well, I think that's our episode on In the Miso Soup. Julie, thank you so much for coming on again. It is, I think I remembered you being on more episodes of this, both because you're always on my charity streams, which I so appreciate, but also because like every season Blake and I are like, we should get Julie on this one, and then I'm like, no, save her. We should get her on like a more thoughtful thing. So,
I'm around, like, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and play Interstate 35. Everyone, it's a mere $8 on Steam. That is a completely reasonable amount of money to play and enjoy something artistically interesting. Blake, next week we're reading The Har.
The Har.
Haar.
Which is how my grandma would say the horror. She'd say the Har.
The Har. I don't know anything about that book. I hope that it can support a discussion as rich as this one.
Folks at home, I'm going to do you a solid. If you want to read that along with us, don't go to your fucking local bookstore looking for this. You will waste your damn time. Unfortunately, you got to give Jeff Bezos that money, because this book, Jacob, it was elusive. It took me forever to get this thing.
It's hard to find. It's an interesting
Just
little
go to
book.
Amazon.
But that's it. Thank you everyone for listening, and until next time, I'm Jacob Geller for Blake Hester. We're all just swirling around in that miso soup. Bye.
ため息 息の出るようなあなたの口づけに甘い恋を夢見る乙女心よ銀色に輝く熱い砂の上で裸で恋をしよう人形のように日に焼けた頬寄せてささやいた約束は二人だけの姫ごとため息が出ちゃう恋の喜びにバラ色の月日よ初めてあなたを見た恋のバカンス日に焼けた頬寄せてささやいた約束は二人だけの姫ごと